GHS compliant safety data sheets and labels. I'm very pleased to introduce Denise Dees to you. Denise is a principal with industrial hygiene and safety consultants out of Shelton, Connecticut. And Denise has a great deal of experience in all areas of industrial hygiene and safety and regulatory compliance, but in particular, and why we asked her to do this presentation for us, is that she's an expert in the classification, GHS-related classification and safety data sheet development and GHS-compliant labeling systems. This webinar, as I hope you know, is the first of two parts. The second part, the first part of this webinar, today's webinar, is going to give us an overview and background on what GHS is and how it has been integrated into the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, with a particular focus on how to do classifications of the regulations related to labeling and hazardous material classifications. The second part of the webinar will occur on February 11th at 2 p.m., and we will do some practical demonstrations and applications for mixtures and how to do the classification, the labeling, and how to author safety data sheets. So let me turn it over now to Denise.
Thank you, George, and thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is hazard communication, and particularly about the revision of the HAZCOM standard and the GHS. So what we're going to be doing here today is we're going to talk just very briefly about some background of where the GHS came from. And I'm going to go through rather quickly the final standard, the final OSHA standard, with an emphasis on the requirements for chemical manufacturers and importers, and that's really what you're interested in. Though I will briefly mention the general requirements for employers, because everyone who's a chemical manufacturer and almost everyone who imports chemicals is also an employer, and therefore has employer obligations under the standard. So those have not changed from the previous standards and those that have been in effect since 1985. We're going to talk a little bit about the hazards that are covered under the GHS and what classification is and how classification works, at least sort of in generalities. I'm not going to go into the details of classification criteria today. We'll talk about that more in part 2, but we'll talk about how the classification process works. We're going to talk about what has to be on safety data sheets and labels and how those are related to the classifications that we develop under this new system. And then finally, where you can get some classification information for your ingredients, because you really need to begin now to meet the deadline of June 1st, 2015 to have all of your safety data sheets and labels converted to the new standard. So just to begin a little history, the GHS does refer to the very long title of the Globally Harmonized System for the Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. The GHS was developed as a UN, a United Nations initiative. The work began with an agreement at the UN Conference on the Environment and the Conference on Environment and Development at Rio, called the Rio Summit in 1992. So it's really been a fairly long time since that process began. The purpose of it was to harmonize the classification and hazard communication elements for chemicals regardless of where they're used, and eventually throughout the world. So that's the goal. We're on the way to that goal, but it's going to take a fairly long time, because various sectors control hazard communication for different types of chemicals in the U.S. and internationally, and also revision of standard of regulations and processes takes time. But the eventual goal will be to have a consistent hazard communication program for all chemicals wherever they're used and throughout the world. The system does consist of a building block approach, and that's it sounds more complicated than it really is. But what that means is that there are different elements of the GHS. Labels are an element, safety data sheets are an element, Also, the classification criteria itself in each of the hazard classes and categories are considered building blocks. So the competent authority in each country or region makes the decision exactly which building blocks they're going to adopt for their system. So transportation and OSHA type of workplace safety don't necessarily adopt all the same elements of the GHS. But the one thing that is good is that if a competent authority adopts a particular building block, it must be taken in its whole and not changed. So at least there's that consistency. So if I do decide to adopt acute toxicity by the oral route in Category 4, I can't change the LD50s that define what that classification means. So there is a standardized approach then for the three basic elements of the GHS. One is to define the physical, environmental, and health hazards, to classify those hazards by taking hazard data and comparing it to criteria, and then finally communicating the hazards in an appropriate way. For consumers, the main mechanism for communicating hazards is, of course, the product label, because they don't typically get safety data sheets in the workplace. It's the safety data sheet in combination, with the label. For transport, it's mainly markings and placards and that sort of thing to quickly communicate the nature of the hazards involved. There are some benefits, very good benefits of the GHS that we hope that we'll reap over time. But some of the most important ones, I think from your perspective as a chemical manufacturer or importer, is that it reduces the need for duplicative testing and also reduces the need for duplicative classification of your chemicals to go with that particular system where you're selling your products. So there will be a great deal more consistency, and also because our test endpoints for determining classification are the same. It should reduce the need for expensive testing for physical properties and also for health hazards. The GHS itself has been published, was originally published in 2003, the first edition, though it was adopted by the UN in 2001. And it is called the Purple Book. The cover stays purple all the time, and there are regular updates every 2 years. Just this fall, the revision 5 of the GHS was issued and is available on the UN website. And I'll give you that website at the end of the presentation here today. And the entire GHS, each revision is available to download and use for free from the UN website. Now the status of GHS adoption, just to give you a little idea of where the world sort of stands in regard to this, is the dark green colors on this map show countries and regions that are in the transition. They've changed their law. They're either fully GHS or they're working toward GHS. So you can see the U.S. and Alaska are green, and all of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, also China, Korea, South Korea, and some other Asian countries have adopted, and in South America, Brazil. The yellow colors represent countries that are in the process of developing their regulations. So that's Canada. And Canada does expect to have their final regulations. Their proposed regulations were out this past year in 2013. They're hoping to have their final regulations out this year, so that by the time that you fully transition to the GHS here in the U.S., that those safety data sheets and those labels will hopefully be acceptable up in Canada as well. The light green colors, Russia and Mexico and South Africa, have voluntary adoptions. Mexico particularly decided, they issued a voluntary NOM about 2 years ago to permit the use of the GHS. And if you use the GHS for labeling and safety data sheets for Mexico and do it in Spanish, it's deemed to be compliant with their mandatory NOM. They do intend to make it a mandatory regulation in the future. So the system itself of the GHS was based on existing systems, so you'll find that there's a great deal of similarity. Particularly for the physical hazards, they are now consistent with the hazard classifications for transport. So if your product is a flammable liquid for transport, it's going to be a flammable liquid under the GHS and under the new OSHA system, so the criteria there have been harmonized. Health hazards are similar to the current OSHA and also EU systems, and the environmental hazards are pretty much exactly the EU system that was then adopted into the IMDG code for classification for aquatic toxicity hazards. So let's talk a little bit about what happened last year. Well, not last year, actually. Now it's 2014. 2 years ago, the final standard adopting the GHS into the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard was published in March of 2012, and it became effective 60 days after that date. In other words, at that time, you could begin the transition to the new system. It was intended to conform to the GHS Revision 3. Now, you just heard me say that we're already on Revision 5, but OSHA, when they proposed the standard, the most recent version was Revision 3. And of course, from the time of a proposed standard to the issuing of a final standard with all the hearings and taking comments and so forth that's involved takes a number of years, and therefore we had to end up with the Revision 3. Most of the revisions to the GHS that have been happening have been clarification and adding some hazard classifications that didn't exist in the original version. So the good thing is that the core information of revision of the OSHA HAZCOM standard in Revision 3 of the GHS is still applicable in these newer revisions. OSHA does intend to make regulatory changes as necessary to keep up with the transitions in the GHS as changes are made there as well. So the standard made some changes to the definition of a hazardous chemical in order to cover all of the hazards that are covered in the GHS. They made changes to how we define a hazard, or now we call that process classification, to label content, and that's where you're going to see the most striking changes, and also safety data sheets, in that there is now a mandatory format for safety data sheets, and we'll go through that at the end of the presentation here today. The effect, as I mentioned, the standard was effective 60 days following publication, so that was May 25th. And the deadlines are on the slide here. So we've already passed the first important deadline where you were supposed to have trained all of your employees on the new labels and safety data sheet format, and that date was this past December 1st. The next big date, and the one that you're facing right now, is that you must comply with the requirements of the new standard. In other words, revising all your safety data sheets and all of your labels by June 1st, 2015. So we've got just about a year and a half to get all of that work accomplished. And I should mention here that it's important for you to think about your distributors too, because distributors have another deadline which is December 1st, 2015, about 5 months after when you have to have all your labels and safety data sheets changed over. But they can't ship any containers without compliant labels after December 1st. So you really should be thinking about not only getting your work done in time for you to be compliant, but also reducing the burden on your distributors so that they don't have to relabel product that's in their warehouses to ship it on to the eventual user. There is no requirement for employers to relabel product once it's in their facility. So products that are shipped up until December 1st, 2015 can still be used without relabeling of those products. There's a final deadline of June 1st, 2016 by which employers have to update their HAZCOM programs and also provide any training on new hazards that may come about because of the changes in how we classify mixtures and substances under the GHS. So there were no changes to a lot of the standard. Nothing with the scope and exemptions, nothing changed in the requirements for a written hazard communication program. There wasn't any change in what has to be labeled or what safety data sheets have to be distributed and made available. In other words, all hazardous chemicals have to be labeled. You have to have safety data sheets for them. I've said the information there's changed, but the basic details of how this works have not changed. And there's no changes in the requirements for information and training or for trade secret protections. And the United States has very generous trade secret protections under the OSHA HAZCOM standard. You have the ability to basically claim the specific chemical identity and also now the exact percent for your products to be a trade secret if it is a legitimate trade secret as defined in the OSHA standard. That isn't true necessarily in other parts of the world. Okay, so here's the format of the standard, and really what I wanted to point out to you, the column on the left-hand side, which is the paragraphs of the standard itself, are basically the same. The information, of course, in those have changed, but the standards, the paragraphs are the same. The important part of the standard, the part that you need to make sure that you have and that you become familiar with and you learn to work with, and that we'll be focusing on in my next webinar with you in about 4 weeks, are the appendices. Appendix A has the health hazard criteria. So this is going to be where you go to see what kind of testing, how to interpret the data that you have about a product to determine if it's an irritant or corrosive or it's acutely toxic. We're going to look a little bit at that today. But that's where all of that criteria is. So the criteria means that it is it's the details about how we interpret the data that we have about mixtures and substances and assign them then to hazard classes and to hazard categories inside those classes. Appendix B does the same thing for the physical hazard. So here's where you're going to find the flashpoint criteria for what's a flammable liquid in Category 1, 2, or 3, and 4 in the U.S. What testing would be done to support the classification for flammable solids, and so forth. So all the criteria around that is in Appendix B. And also it tells us how to deal with mixtures in both of those. Appendix C is extremely important because based on the classification, then that defines what appears on the label. So the allocation of label elements is in Appendix C. So if you have classified your product as a flammable liquid Category 2, you go to Appendix C of the standard to see what needs to be on the label to communicate that hazard to your downstream users. Appendix D has all the details of what has to be in each section of the safety data sheet, so you also need to become familiar with that so that you know what specific fields need to be in each section and where all of that information goes. And we'll talk a little bit about that later today too. Finally, Appendix E is the definition of a trade secret. So if you're interested in claiming some of the composition of your product to be a trade secret, you probably want to review that. And also, under what circumstances would you need to disclose that information? All of that's covered in both a combination of paragraph I of standard under trade secrets and then the definition. So as I said, there's a scope and application. There have really been no change. It still applies to all hazardous chemicals known to be present in the workplace in such a manner that employees may be exposed to them. And this is very important under normal conditions of use or in a foreseeable emergency. So OSHA expects us not just to look at the hazards of the product as you put it in the container and ship it to your user, but is there something in the normal use of that that results in a hazardous decomposition product that you might need to warn people about? Is the normal use of that resulting in a change, some sort of chemical reaction or something like that? And this is really important when we start looking at things like building materials, steel that in the shipped form is completely not hazardous, but it's going to be cut, it's going to be welded, and so there'll be exposure to fumes and dusts. And also for welding materials, where we have to look now at the constituents of our fume in welding to do the proper classification for the product. And OSHA's put out some guidance recently on combustible dust that again talks to this point about it's not just as you ship it, not just as you provide it, but also in the normal use or foreseeable emergency will that generate a potentially combustible dust. And therefore, if that's the case, you may have to consider that for classification. All the labeling and the full exemptions of the standard were retained, and also there's no change in the requirements for laboratory and warehouse coverage. So I just want to briefly mention what the labeling exemptions are. I find that many people over the years have sort of forgotten how that the OSHA standard, it contains two separate sets of exemptions. The first set of exemptions in the standard is for labeling only. And this is generally for products that are labeled under another standard, another regulation. for example, pesticides in food and cosmetics and veterinary devices and alcoholic beverages, all of those are labeled under other regulations and therefore would not be required to be labeled under this. Consumer products, when they're labeled in accordance with the CPSC, or what's also called the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, will also not be labeled with OSHA labels. So if you use consumer products in the workplace, those products will not necessarily, well, they won't have a GHS label. They will have a GHS compliant or an OSHA compliant safety data sheet. But the products themselves, if they're sold primarily to the consumer, because CPSC has not adopted the GHS yet, will not have GHS labels. There are also full exemptions from the standard, and this means these chemicals are just not covered in the HAZCOM standard at all. And so they include things like hazardous waste and wood products that will not be processed. So if you cut that wood or you sand that wood, it's now chemical and it would be covered under the standard. But if it's just, just have it in the workplace, it would not be. Articles that don't release any hazardous chemicals in their use would also not be covered by the standard. So these are all the same as in the past. There's a few other exemptions: drugs in their final form, intended for the patient, cosmetics, packaged for sale, consumer products are also outside the scope, not just from labeling, but of the HAZCOM standard entirely if they're used in a consumer manner in the workplace. However, if they're used at a higher frequency or higher amounts than a normal consumer would use, then you would have to cover that in your HAZCOM program. In the definition section, all of the physical hazard definitions have been removed. So now we find all of those used to in the standard. It said flammable liquids with a flash point of da-da-da. Now all of that information has been removed and is now in the appendices because they're considered criteria. We've also added some important definitions to the standard, and some of the definitions have just been revised to be consistent with the GHS. Some important new definitions or things that we're going to talk about a lot here today is the concept of classification, and that is defined in the standard: hazard category, hazard class, hazard statements, all of the label elements that we'll see, pictograms and precautionary statements and so forth. But also there are some new hazards that are included in the HAZCOM standard. One is hazards not otherwise classified. We'll talk about what that is. And then pyrophoric gases, simple asphyxiants, and also combustible dust. OSHA did include 3 hazards that are not part of the GS in order to retain the level of protection for workers and making sure that people that use these get appropriate information. And those include pyrophoric gases, simple asphyxiants, and combustible dust. And they are pyrophoric gas and simple asphyxiant defined in the standard in the definition section, because there is no criteria for these in the GHS. And you'll see the definitions here probably don't have anything to do with your products. And finally, combustible dust. And combustible dust does not have a definition at this time, but there are requirements for classification and label elements. OSHA's position is that they have a great deal of guidance on how to determine if a product is a combustible dust on their website and other documents that they produce. And since they are working on a combustible dust standard that will include defining criteria to a certain extent, they didn't want to incorporate that into the final OSHA standard. So this is a hazard that's covered but not necessarily defined in the body of the standard itself. Hazards not otherwise classified is a concept that they wanted included in the proposed standard. They just changed the title to HNOCs now because there's concern that there might be hazards that that the classifier becomes aware of during the classification process, but doesn't fit into any of the specific hazard classes of the GHS. But if it is a significant hazard that might result in an adverse health effect or physical effect, then we would have to make sure that users are informed of that. And they do that by referring to it as a hazard not otherwise classified. Information about that would not be required on the label, but will be required in Section 2 of the safety data sheet. So as I mentioned earlier, hazard classification is really the crux of I think the GHS, because it's a way of looking at our data about hazards and then assigning the appropriate hazard classification based on that data by comparing it to criteria that appears in Appendix A and Appendix B of the standard. Now the GHS also includes environmental classification, and if you're a company that markets internationally, you're going to need to know about that. So you're going to have to get the GHS sections on the environmental classification. We won't be talking about that during our sessions here, but if you do have questions about that, you can feel free to contact me, send me an email. I'll be glad to respond and at least answer any questions that you have. The criteria for environmental hazards in the GHS is the same as the environmental hazards that are in the that is covered under the criteria is the same as the IMDG code. So that defines what materials might have to be transported as Class 9 if you're transporting by ocean, or even by road and rail if you're transporting products in the EU, where they've incorporated that into their transport system as well. Not all of the environmental hazards are Class 9 for transport, but the more serious hazards are incorporated into the transport regulations. That isn't true in the United States, and it's not true in Canada. So you can breathe a sigh of relief that if all you're doing is selling in the US and Canada, you don't have to worry about the environmental classification. So another big difference in classification between the old HAZCOM and our new HAZCOM is that we no longer have a floor of hazardous chemicals. The previous standard said that everything that was a carcinogen under IARC or NTP or OSHA, or had an ACGIH TLV or an OSHA PEL, permissive exposure limit, was automatically hazardous. And that language has been removed from the new standard. And now hazardous chemicals are those that meet the criteria of being a health hazard or a physical hazard in the standard, or are those OSHA-defined hazards. Another difference is that the mixture rules are going to vary depending on the hazard classes. So for health hazards, where we used to have a rule that a product, an untested mixture, was assumed to have all the same hazards as any ingredient present at 1% or more, or 0.1% for carcinogens, now the rules will change or different in how we look at mixtures for each hazard class. A number of them still use a cutoff concentration for an ingredient present above a certain concentration, but some take an entirely different approach. So you may find that some of your products change quite drastically in how they're classified. So in the hazard classification process, we compare the data that we have about our chemical, substance, or mixture to the criteria. We have to consider all the hazard classes, and there's quite a few of them, and we'll look at those in a moment, because a product can have more than one hazard class. It could be both a flammable liquid and toxic, and maybe a reproductive toxin. So there could be any number of hazards, and all that apply to that particular mixture or substance that meet the criteria will have to be identified as part of the classification process. In general, the categories 1, 2, 3, 4, as the case may be, will be equivalent if that hazard is covered in transport to the packing groups. And the only real exception to that is going to be for acute toxicity, and that's mainly because of difference in the testing that's done, and also for inhalation toxicity, the fact that we can consider saturated vapor concentration when we classify for inhalation toxicity for vapors under transport, but we do not under the GHS or under the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what a hazard class is and what a hazard category is, but just to remind you, a hazard class is the nature of the hazard. So it is a large grouping of flammable liquids or flammable solids or oxidizers, or for health hazards, sensitizers, or aspiration toxicity. So these are the nature of the hazard, and inside those hazards there may be multiple degrees of hazard, and those are referred to as categories. So the full classification of a mixture of substance in a particular hazard class often will include both the hazard class by its name, and also a numerical hazard category for the degree of hazard. So these are the physical hazards that are covered in the HAZCOM 2012 standard and in the GHS. And so you'll see there's quite a number of these. It looks like many, many more than we had in the old HAZCOM standard. But the main reason is that oxidizers now have 3 categories instead of, or 3 classes, excuse me, rather than a single class of oxidizers. We have gases and liquids and solids. And the reason that we have that is because the way that we classify for each of these physical forms is different. And the testing that supports the classification would be a different test for a liquid versus a solid. So these are all the hazards that we now incorporate. The last 2 here on the right-hand side, pyrophoric gases and combustible dust, again, are OSHA-specific hazards and are not part of the GHS. The health hazards that are covered under the GHS also look to be more in number and more involved. But in fact, all of these hazards have been covered in the past, but were lumped up into a large bucket called target organ effects. But we now include acute toxicity, which is poisons that cause serious and immediate lethality or serious health effects or death at fairly low doses. And so we determine that by looking at data that's been generated generally from animal studies, where we calculate LD50, which is a lethal dose at 50% of the test animals, or a lethal concentration, LC50, for materials that are toxic by inhalation. And so we'll look at how we take that data and do that classification. We include skin corrosives and irritants, and serious eye damage, which would be corrosives to the eye tissue that cause irreversible effects, and then irritation, respiratory and skin sensitization, germ cell mutagenicity, which is a classification of chemicals that cause mutations in germ cells that are heritable. So these can be passed on from the parent to the progeny to the child because of an actual change in the structure of the DNA in the germ cells themselves. So it's not just a chemical that can cause a positive Ames test, but would actually have an ability to interact with germ cells in the human body. Carcinogens, of course, are covered. Reproductive toxicity, and now we look at effects on fertility and development, but also chemicals that cause effects on or via lactation. So that can get into breast milk, can either interfere with breastfeeding or can cause adverse effects on the child that's being nursed. Specific target organ toxicity, we look at both single and repeat dose. And there would be something like methanol, which is considered a specific target organ toxicity single exposure. A single large dose by ingestion would cause blindness. So that's an example there. And then of course repeated exposure would be chemicals like silica that over prolonged periods of time of inhalation would cause damage to an organ. In this case it would be the lungs. Aspiration hazard is another hazard class, and one that I think that you'll be looking at and interested in, because this involves any product, any mixture, or any substance that's a hydrocarbon, a liquid hydrocarbon, or a mixture containing 10% or more of a liquid hydrocarbon that has low viscosity. And that viscosity cutoff is 20.5 millimeters squared per second. But when you're looking at your products, many ink products will incorporate some oils or other hydrocarbons. So that could be any hydrocarbon solvent like toluene or desine, or any aliphatic or aromatic hydrocarbon could be incorporated there. And then if it's low enough viscosity to where it can be sucked into the lungs during ingestion, then it would be captured in this classification. And then finally we have simple asphyxiants, which is again an OSHA-specific hazard. Now I mentioned earlier that OSHA didn't adopt the environmental hazards. In the GHS there are 2 different classes for environmental hazards: aquatic toxicity, actually divided into both to acute or short-term toxicity and then long-term toxicity or chronic, and then hazardous to the ozone layer. These hazards are, you're certainly, OSHA has no problem with you including those on your safety data sheet if you want to, and you may have an interest in that if you're doing international sales and are selling your product in countries that have adopted the environmental hazards. But again, if you're not required to do that, then it's certainly not an OSHA requirement. So let's talk a little bit about how the classification process works. Now, as I said, when we get back together again, we're going to take some actual examples that I hope some of you will be sending in so that we can do some real classifications and give you some practical experience in that. But we'll talk a little bit about the process and how that works here today. So probably one of the more common physical hazards that would be in the products that you sell would be potentially flammable or combustible liquids. The classification for those materials is done based on two data elements: the flash point of the substance or the flash point of the mixture, so you actually test it to determine the flash point, and the methods that are required to be used are all closed cup methods, so don't use open cup. Transport requires closed cup testing, and so does the classification under the GHS. And then we also have to know the boiling point, the initial boiling point of your mixture or your substance to do the classification, because you can see that the difference between Category 1 and Category 2, just kind of point that out. Category 1 here and Category 2 is really that the flash point criteria is the same, but the boiling point is different. So if the boiling point is 35 C or less, it's going to be Category 1. But if the boiling point is greater than 35 C, then it's Category 2. And the boiling point no longer matters once we get into the Categories 3 and 4. Only the flash point is taken into consideration there. So we're going to need both pieces of that information to assign to determine, is my product a flammable liquid at all? And the answer there, if the flash point was greater than 93 degrees C, then it's not classified. But if it is below 93 degrees C, then I'm going to need to assign it to a category to then figure out what I have to communicate about those hazards. Then for a health hazard like acute toxicity, we're going to take for our substances and tested mixtures the oral LD50 or the dermal LD50 or the inhalation toxicity values, the LC50, depending on what form the material is in, if it's a gas or vapor or a dust. You have to determine that before you can do the classification for your substance. Then you will take the values that you have and then apply those, or take them to this table and determine the hazard category, or if the material meets the criteria of being acutely toxic at all. Now, OSHA did not adopt Category 5. Category 5 of the GHS was originally intended for consumer products. So when CPSC adopts the GHS for consumer products in the future, they'll adopt Category 5. But in the workplace, we stop at Category 4. So if, for example, you had a substance that you were selling and it had an oral LD50 of 3,000 milligrams per kilogram, it would not be hazardous for acute toxicity because it would be above the cutoff for Category 4. We'll talk in a minute about how we look at mixtures for these kinds of materials if they're not tested. Now, if you took your product, your mixture, and you actually took it to a lab and had them do the testing to determine the LD50 or LC50, then you could use that data directly with this table to assign your classification. But generally, mixtures aren't tested. The testing is very expensive. It also is considered to be, potentially unnecessarily cruel to animals to test a material for its toxicity when you can estimate its toxicity based on the information about the mixtures, about the ingredients. So we'll look at that approach, and which is one you'll be much more likely to use in a couple of slides here. Now for things like reproductive toxins and carcinogens and germ cell mutagens, our data is far more descriptive, and we take for classification for those hazards what we call a weight of evidence approach. So we gather all the information that we can about that hazard, so all this data about carcinogenicity, epidemiological studies, or other kinds of data, animal data and so forth. And we look at all of it together, looking at the scientific validity and the statistical significance of that, and determine based on that approach the classification. So it's much like what IARC does when they classify substances. And we have category 1, which is subdivided into subcategories. And again, you'll see the same pattern in those other hazards I mentioned. And the things that we know are carcinogenic to humans because we studied populations who are exposed and they have an increased incidence of cancer, would be assigned to category 1A. And then if we have very strong animal data, then it's going to be 1B. And if it's not quite as convincing of data, then it's category 2. This is hard to do. It's hard for those of us with lots of experience to do, and it's certainly difficult, I think, for lay people to do. So for the most part, the good part is that you should be able to rely on your suppliers for their classifications of your raw materials in terms of their carcinogenicity. And if IARC or NTP has evaluated that substance, then under the OSHA regulation, we're allowed to rely on that classification. OSHA does require that you identify any substances over at a tenth of a percent or greater in your mixture that have been identified by IARC or NTP or OSHA as carcinogens in the safety data sheet, and I'll remind you of that later. Okay, so for mixtures, and those are just a couple of the hazards. And again, when we get into you're probably not going to do a lot of substance classification, to be honest with you. As I said, it tends to be rather complex. So what I'm going to talk about a little later here today is where would you find these classifications if you're trying to do mixtures. And at our next practical session, then we'll really get into the nitty-gritty of doing mixtures because that's really where your work will need to be. But basically the concept of doing mixtures is that for physical hazards, we're going to mostly test the mixture as a whole. Now there are a few hazards in the GHS that have some rules about how you can calculate the hazards from a physical hazard standpoint of mixtures, but for the most part you're going to have to test the product as a whole. So if your product has flammable constituents, you're going to probably need to do a flash point. If your product has corrosive constituents, you may or may not, corrosive from a metal corrosion perspective, then you probably will need to do a test to determine if your mixture is corrosive to metals. For health hazards, then, and in hazards, we can do things that we call bridging principles, but they're really not all that practical. They're kind of complicated to read, and I'm not going to bore you with going through those today. But they basically allow us to take data. If we've tested one mixture, and then we dilute it, or we're doing just batch variation, we concentrate that, or we have mixtures with the same ingredients, but we have to have a tested mixture to start with in order to use these bridging principles. So unless you've done some testing of your mixtures, you're probably not going to follow any bridging principles for your classification. Then the alternate approaches are to use some additivity formulas for certain hazard classes, and then there will be other situations, most of the health hazards, where your classification will be based on cutoff values. That means that a concentration of a particular ingredient in your mixture then will make the entire mixture have that hazard class. And those are all going to be hazard class specific. When you read Appendix A of the OSHA standard, there's a sort of a beginning part that you should read over that talks a little bit about the concepts of classifying substances and mixtures. And then in each section, each hazard class discussion, it will tell you what approach for mixtures is used. So basically our mixture rules are going to be, for acute toxicity, we use an additivity formula to calculate the acute toxicity estimate. And that number we use with the acute toxicity table, and I'll give you an example of how that's done. And then, as I said, next time we'll do some of those in real life. For skin corrosion and irritation, we also have an additivity approach and a table that we use for doing those. So we are adding up all of the skin corrosives, categories 1, A, B, and C, and also in category 2 and category 3. Only category 2, sorry. And then we would based on the total, use a table to do the classification. The same thing is true with serious eye damage and eye irritation. Respiratory and skin sensitization, there's a simple cutoff concentration, and that's going to generally be 0.1% of an ingredient that's classified as a skin or respiratory sensitizer, and your mixture is going to make your product a mixture. And that will be true unless you have enough data to assign that sensitizer to a lower category. There's a category 1A and 1B, and 1B is a less severe sensitizer. So if your supplier has enough information about the severity and the frequency of the sensitization, and they tell you it's a 1B, then you will be able to use a higher cutoff, which is 1%. Germ cell mutagenicity uses a cutoff concentration, and that's not going to be additive. In other words, we look at them as single individual ingredients. The same thing is true with carcinogenicity. It's a simple cutoff concentration. Reproductive toxicity also is a cutoff concentration without additivity. And specific target organ toxicity, there again is going to be cutoff concentrations, and generally are not considered to be additive except for category 3 for single exposure. And we'll probably talk about that a bit next time, because category 3 is respiratory irritants and narcotic effects, which are solvent, dizziness, drowsiness effects. Those fall into that category 3, and those actually are considered to be additive under most circumstances if they're in the same type of category 3. In other words, all the respiratory irritants would be added together, and all the narcotic chemicals would be added together to meet a particular cutoff. And then finally, aspiration toxicity is a cutoff of 10% total hydrocarbons, and also that meet the viscosity criteria. So this is a two-part thing. If you only had 8% hydrocarbons, you wouldn't need to worry about the viscosity. But if it's 11% hydrocarbons, then you have to consider the viscosity to see whether your product meets the criteria for being an aspiration hazard. So just to give you a couple of very brief kind of ideas of how we do these mixtures, is when we do acute toxicity, we have to, first of all, we have to determine what the relevant ingredients are. And the relevant ingredients are any that are classified as toxic. In any of the categories 1 through 4. So if we have acute toxicity, two of your ingredients, and for oral toxicity, and they're both classified for acute toxicity, then you'd want to calculate the mixture classification, and those ingredients would be what we'd look at. Now, we do not have to add in to our formula things that are presumed to be non-toxic, like water and polymers that are just inert. Sugar. There's some examples in the GHS, and you'll have to review your raw materials and determine where you don't have data. Is the reason that you don't have data is because the product is really presumed to be non-toxic. Those then just fall to the wayside, and we don't incorporate those into our classification. If we have large amounts of materials that we can't presume to be non-toxic, greater than 10%, then we have to adjust our formula to determine the classification based on the known ingredients. And then we include a statement on the safety data sheet and the label that a certain percentage of your material consists of ingredients of unknown acute toxicity. So we take this formula looks very complicated, but it's really not hard. We take the concentration of here I'm marking it so you can see of the ingredient, and then divide that by its acute toxicity. The LD50 or the LC50. And then you take each potentially toxic ingredient and do that little division, simple division, concentration over the toxicity, and then add those all together. We come up with a number on this side of the equation, and then we're going to solve for the ATE for the mixture. So we basically flip those, and we're going to take 100 and divide it by the number we end up with over here, and that will give us our acute toxicity estimate. And that's going to be a number. It's going to be a number like 327 milligrams per kilogram. And then that number, or it might be 5.4 milligrams per liter. Whatever that number is, and it works for all routes, but we don't mix the routes. So you're going to do this for the oral route, And if you have ingredients that are toxic by dermal contact, you're going to do another formula, another calculation for the dermal route. And then finally, potentially a third calculation for the inhalation route. That's going to depend on what your ingredients are, how you do that. Then we take that number and we will go back to the table. We will go back to that table that we had originally and just put that number into the cells and figure out what the classification of our mixture is using the acute toxicity table. So just a reminder, we take that number 327 that I calculated and figure out where it would be. If I got 327 milligrams per kilogram orally, then that's where I'd end up right here in category 4 for my mixture. So this table is used for both substances and mixtures. There's more to it. It's not quite that simple, but when we get into the examples, I think it'll make more sense and we'll be able to understand how to use that better. For things like, which you'll also run into probably even more frequently, are skin corrosives or eye damage, eye irritants, eye damage. And they have formulas that look, or rather tables that look like this. So here we take the sum of the ingredients that are classified in category 1. So we add them all up together. And these are in percent. So if I have 2% of one ingredient that's classified in category 1 for skin corrosion, and I have 1% of another ingredient that's a corrosive, that would give me a total of 3. And then if that was all that's where I'd start on this process. And I would come to this table and I would see that 3% of total of the skin category 1 would put me into skin category 2. That's because I'd have 3%. And I'd really be done, because even though I had other ingredients that are category 2, I can't get a more severe classification than category 2 without having a total of 5%. I'd have to have more category 1s to add in. So we basically do our addition down the road. If the product didn't have enough corrosives to be in category 2, in other words less than 1% total, then I would look at all my skin category 2s and add them up. And if they're 10%, then they'd be in category 2. OSHA did not adopt category 3. It's part of the GHS, but it's not OSHA, so you don't even need to worry about going over to category 3. So we don't need to worry about this line either. And then category, if it still isn't classified, then we go down to taking the total of our skin category 1, the corrosives, and multiply that times 10, and add that to the total of our skin category 2. And if that's 10% or more, then the product becomes a category 2 skin irritant. So it looks complicated. Once you get accustomed to doing it, it's really not that complex. And there are some people out, actually I have a colleague that developed a spreadsheet that you can put your stuff in and it'll run these, do the numbers for you. And I'll be happy to share that with you, though we haven't entirely beta tested it. So it will be if you want to use it, you're welcome. Drop me an email. I'll send it to you, but I can't guarantee that it's going to be 100% accurate. Okay, so eye irritation looks a lot the same way, but the table has different numbers in it. It's 3% for eye damage and 3% in your skin category 2. And here I should also mention, and we'll go into this again in more detail next time, but there are situations that the standard says we can't use additivity. If we have mixtures with a high pH or a low pH, we have to classify those based on the pH and not this process of additivity. So you're going to be the pH extremes that they talk about in the standard are 2 or less for acidic products and 11.5 or greater for basic products. You are permitted to consider alkali and acid reserve when you do these classifications for your mixtures, but there's really not any guidance on how to do that, how to make that actually useful for you. But at any rate, these are going to be some of the complexities I think you'll be dealing with, because you probably, in your water-based products, you're going to be looking at materials where additivity doesn't apply, and then other circumstances where you'll be using additivity for your classification. Now other materials, these other ones I talked about, with basic cutoffs, the concept of classification is the presence of a single ingredient classified in a particular category then results in classification of the mixture. So here if I had 0.1% or more of a Category 1 carcinogen, under the standard my product will be classified in Category 1. If I have 0.1% or more of Category 2, then it's going to be classified in Category 2. And we'll have the similar approach with germ cell mutagenicity and reproductive toxicity as well. Just keep in mind that even if your product had 2 carcinogens in it and one is Category 1 and one is Category 2, we always apply the most severe hazard classification. Okay. I noticed that there just one question, and I thought I'd just stop for a second before we go on to labeling to talk about just to respond to this comment. And this comment says that approximately 90% of our current suppliers don't have GHS safety data sheets available for their materials, and that they're telling you 2014 or maybe even 2015, and how are you possibly going to deal with that? And that question actually comes up often when I'm at conferences, and I've been on panels talking about the GHS with representatives from OSHA, and their response to that is, well, that most substances have already been classified at the international level, and that you can always look at that information and determine your classification based on the work that's been done under REACH and other efforts that have been ongoing. I don't know how comfortable you are with that. However, I'm going to show you some places that you can get information on classification of substances that then you could move forward. Now the negative part about that, and I'll be honest with you, is that if your supplier then comes back to you with a different classification than what you determine from the REACH registration or other sources of data, then you're probably going to have to reevaluate that classification. But our hope would be that in many cases they're going to be relying on the same sources you are, and they will support the classifications that you determined on your own. But to be honest, it is unfortunate we didn't have the standard. It was discussed during the comment periods, it was discussed during the hearings, having substances before mixtures. That wasn't the approach that OSHA took. So we will have to try to do the best we can to move forward without the information from your suppliers, because if you have a lot of products, you simply can't wait until next year to start working on your labels and your safety data sheets. So I feel your pain, and I really do understand how frustrating that is, but we really don't have an option. Okay, so I'm going to leave classification at this point, but I'm glad to answer any additional questions that you have about it when we get to the end. And we can talk a little bit if we have time, but again, next time we'll do some specific examples, and hopefully if you do your homework, which I'm going to suggest, then we can do some very practical experience stuff at the next webinar to make this much more useful for you so that you can really become comfortable with the process of classification. So the next part of the standard is really talking about labeling, and that's the next step for you. Once you've classified your product, now you're going to determine the labeling. Some of you might say, well, gee, shouldn't you do the safety data sheet first? But really the safety data sheet is sort of the third step. And the reason is that the labeling, the classification and the labeling is required on the safety data sheet now in Section 2. And these will really inform the entire content of the safety data sheet, because that you want to have a document that's internally consistent with the classification that you've applied. So the next step really, from my perspective, is to take a look at the labeling. You could do that in the context of writing the safety data sheet, and that's fine, but from my perspective this is sort of the way that we tend to work. Okay, so the labeling basically now is going to be based on the hazard classification. So once we've determined the classification, we no longer say, oh, now I'm going to write a label. We now instead look at Appendix C, define the specific requirements for what's going to be on the label, and I'm going to give you some examples of how that works. But first let's talk about what has to be on the label. OSHA requires that these elements be included on the label for all shipped containers. So the product identifier, which can be any trade name or any name that you want to apply as long as it's the same as used on the safety data sheet. A signal word, which will be either danger or warning, hazard statements, precautionary statements, pictograms, and the name and address and telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. So do remember that in the past we didn't have to have telephone numbers on the labels. In the future we will. You will have to include an unknown acute toxicity statement if you have ingredients of unknown acute toxicity that are considered relevant for that classification. But there is no requirement for information about hazards not otherwise classified. That just goes on the MSDS or the safety data sheet, not on the label. So the product number identifier, as I mentioned, is any name or whatever you choose to call your product, as long as it allows for cross-referencing between the list of hazardous chemicals, the label, and the safety data sheet. Signal words, there's only 2 in the GHS and then HAZCOM 2012, and those are danger for the more severe hazards and warning for less severe hazards. And there are a few hazards that don't even require the use of a signal word. And that is determined by the classification in the tables that you're going to use to do your label. Now they also incorporate the requirement for pictograms to represent the hazards of your product. And so these pictograms, there are 9 in the GHS. There are only 8 that were adopted by HAZCOM 2012, the environmental one being the one that's not adopted. OSHA does require that on shipped containers that the border around the pictogram must be red. And it must be thick enough to be noticeable. So there's no specific thickness, no millimeters or anything specifically required, but it has to be large enough, the pictogram, to be noticeable on the label, and it also has, the border must be thick enough to be noticeable as well. There are, as I mentioned, 8 pictograms in the GHS, and where there was a symbol, the symbol being the black stuff on the inside here, this stuff, where there was a symbol used for that hazard for transport, that got adopted into the GHS. And so we have unstable explosives and self-reactives and organic peroxides getting the explosive pictogram, the exploding bomb. The flame pictogram is used for all flammables, so flammable gases and aerosols and liquids and solids and certain self-reactives, self-heating substances, and organic peroxides that are not explosive but still present a fire hazard. The flame over the circle pictogram is for oxidizers, the O being the oxygen and the flame representing the fact that it presents a hazard of flammability in contact with combustible materials or other materials that may react with. There's a gas cylinder that's used for compressed gases and liquefied gases and refrigerated liquefied gases and dissolved gases. The corrosive symbol, which is the same as we use it for Class 8 in transport, is used for corrosive to metals under the OSHA standard. So if your product corrodes aluminum or steel at 6.25 millimeters per year or greater at 55 C, then you'll have to classify your product as corrosive to metals, and it would get this pictogram. Skin corrosives, obviously category, not irritants, even though it says that's just the name of the hazard class, but skin corrosives, those in category 1, A, B, and C, which are equivalent to packing group 1, 2, and 3 of Class 8 skin corrosives in the transport regs. Those would get the corrosive symbol, and also serious eye damage in category 1. Now what's I think important or interesting about that is that we will now see this corrosive pictogram on products that are not corrosive to skin, that just cause eye damage. And you will be putting those on your safety data sheets. If you have products that have a high percentage of category 1 surfactants, 3% or greater, it becomes a serious eye damage unless you have testing to prove it's not, and therefore it will get this pictogram on the label. We also have the skull and crossbones that's used for acute toxicity in categories 1 through 3, again with the low LC and LD50s. A lot of the products that I see that are typical for ink kinds of products won't bear this pictogram because they tend to be lesser, not that toxic, and therefore may fall into category 4, but then they wouldn't get the skull and crossbones. The exclamation mark, a pictogram, is used for other lower level hazards, including acute toxicity category 4, and then skin irritants category 2, eye irritants in category 2. Actually, OSHA did incorporate 2A and 2B, and I did not update that slide, so my apologies. Skin sensitizers, and then specific target organ toxins, single exposure in category 3. So these are just those things I talked about earlier that are respiratory tract irritants and narcotic effects, but don't actually cause systemic target organ damage. And then ozone depleting substances if you were doing international where they have adopted that. And then we have the exploding man, which is actually referred to as the health hazard pictogram, and that's for respiratory sensitizers, germ cell mutagens, carcinogens, reprotoxins, specific target organ toxins in categories 1 and 2, either single or repeat dose. And then finally aspiration hazards, aspiration toxicity materials, those are those hydrocarbons again with low viscosity. They get this pictogram also. The one that OSHA didn't adopt is the environmental, but it's my favorite. And it is for acute hazards to the aquatic environment, category 1, for acute, and for chronic categories 1 and 2. So not all the environmental hazards get the pictogram, only the more severe hazards. And I should point out that if it has this hazard pictogram, then it generally will meet the criteria for being Class 9 for transport internationally as well. Now, in addition to the pictograms, your label has to have hazard statements and precautionary statements. And those hazard statements are going to be designed to communicate further the degree of hazard. So for flammable liquids, category 1, which is the most severe hazard, says extremely flammable liquid and vapor. The category 4, which is the least hazardous, has the highest flash point, just says combustible liquid. So you can see that there's a difference in the hazard statement inside the hazard class that communicate the degree of hazard. The category numbers for your labels category numbers do not appear on the labels. Only the hazard statements themselves appear. So the precautionary statements follow something similar. They're selected by the people who develop the GHS based on the hazards and what they think would be necessary for you to communicate for prevention of the hazard, for prevention, for response being fire response, spill response, or first aid, storage, and then finally disposal. And not every hazard type is going to have statements in all of those categories. And you'll see how that works because it's in the table, and you pick the ones that are associated on the table with your hazard. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this might work, or how it does work. And for our first example, I've given you a flammable gas. There's my criteria or my data about my gas. And if I had the table out and looked at it, I'd see that this meets category 1 for flammable gas. It's the criteria based on the UEL and the LEL. And so after we've done that classification, then we're going to go to this table. This comes right out of Appendix C in the OSHA standard. So I'm looking up flammable gases, and I see here's category 1. So these are all my label elements. Now if this gas didn't have any other hazard, I could just do this label from the single table. So you can see my signal word is danger. My hazard statement is extremely flammable gas. I have to use the pictogram for the flame. And then I'm going to use these prevention, response, and storage statements. Now I don't have a disposal statement for this because gases, you don't really dispose of gases like you would a liquid or a solid. And so it wasn't felt necessary to do that. But we do have information again about a prevention statement, a response statement, and a storage statement. OSHA expects us to use all of the precautionary statements that appear in the tables unless we can show that they are inappropriate. So just keep that in mind. You may end up with a lot of precautionary statements if you have a product with a lot of different hazards. Here's another example. We've got this is an example of what your label will look like. I apologize, I skipped ahead. So you can see there's our product identifier and all the other information that were required in addition to the company's name, address, and their telephone number. Now here's another example. This is a material that this is a substance. It's not a mixture, but it is toxic. It has toxic constituents. And so we have some data about the oral LD50 in rats and the dermal LD50 and the LC50 for vapor, as a vapor for this material. And so we took that table that we saw before, which I have over here, and because we're looking at a number of oral LD50 of 200, I'd come over to the table and say, where does 200 fall? Oh, here we go. It's category 3. So I'm going to assign my classifications based on the information in the acute toxicity table. So I have acute toxicity oral category 3, dermal 1, and inhalation category 3 based on my data. So the next step is for me to look at the tables. In this case, I'm going to have to look at 3 different tables. I have to look at an oral table, an inhalation table, and a dermal table. So here's the table that I have for acute toxicity category 3. And you can see it's given me a danger signal word, toxic if swallowed, a skull and crossbones, and some prevention, some various precautionary statements that I will have to incorporate on my label. So then I'm going to also look at the dermal table. And I have a dermal 1. So it's still danger. And once we get danger, we don't care about signal words anymore because you're not going to use 2, and danger is the most severe. So you don't really need to look at any of the rest of them. And then we have a statement of fatal in contact with the skin, and again the same pictogram, and a bunch of other prevention, response, storage, and disposal statements. And then remember it's also toxic by inhalation. So toxic by inhalation category 3, I go to that table and I again find same signal word, a new hazard statement, same pictogram, and some more precautionary statements. So when I put this all together to put on my label, this is what my label looks like. I have a single pictogram. This is the name of the product, danger. And now I've got different hazard statements. Remember, my hazard statement for skin was fatal, but toxic was for both swallowed and inhaled. And I am allowed to combine that statement if I wanted to. I could put toxic if swallowed and toxic if inhaled separately, but I can also combine them if that saves me room and it makes it more readable and understandable. So I've chosen to do that. And now you see I've got a lot of prevention statements for response because my product is hazardous by different routes of exposure. I'm going to have some first aid for ingestion and also for skin and inhalation. And then for storage, how are we doing? Okay. For storage here and also disposal statement. For our third example, we have a product that has 2 different hazards. And I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how we do those. So in this case we have a product that's a flammable liquid, but it's also been classified as a carcinogen. So I have 2 different classifications. So I know it's a flammable liquid because I actually did a flash point for my products and I have a boiling point, and I've determined that the product itself falls into the classification as flammable liquid category 2, not just the component, and also that it has more than 0.1% of carcinogen, and therefore my mixture is classified as carcinogen category 2. So again, we're going to have 2 different tables. Category 2, we looked at our flash point. I'm sorry, I'm just going to scoot because we're getting along on time. Our classification is carcinogen, so I've determined my mixture classification, and then I go to my tables. And here's my table for flammable liquids, looking at my category 2, danger, highly flammable liquid and vapor, and all of the required information there. I'm going to add that to all the information, the label elements for carcinogenicity for category 1. And it's going to say may cause cancer, and it has a different pictogram now, and some other prevention statements. And finally, I will assemble that all into a label that now has 2 different pictograms. And I will tell you, I've written labels that have 7 so far. I've never had 8, but you can have a lot of pictograms if you have a highly hazardous material. A single signal word. We're going to have different hazard statements for encompassing the 2 different kinds of hazards that we have here, and then these are all of our precautionary statements. Now you notice on some of my earlier ones I identified the response and the prevention, storage, and disposal, but there's no requirement to do that. OSHA gives you flexibility about the layout of the label, so you can identify those, you cannot identify those. The only thing is that we want to make sure that the required label elements do appear together, grouped together on the label, so that it's all, you don't want to take your prevention statements and put them somewhere else away from the other required elements of the label. Just so you know, there is not a requirement for full labeling of products in the workplace. So if you're taking in your workplace products out of the original container and putting them into smaller containers or any kind of secondary container labeling, you can incorporate the GHS elements, or you can use any combinations of words and pictures that at least communicate the basic hazards and that you provide with additional information always immediately available that will give the employees the more complete information about the hazards of the chemical and also the precautionary information. So for your internal labeling, you have really all the same options that you had in the past. Because I can't stand to not do this talk, or to do this talk and not mention that you've got to be careful if you're going to continue to use NFPA and HMIS, because in the OSHA HAZCOM standard, the Category 1 is always the highest level of hazard. Now, in the GHS and in OSHA HAZCOM 2012, not all hazard classes even have categories, and they certainly don't have the same number. Some have 4 categories, others have 1 category or 2. So we have to start with 1 and then number the other categories accordingly. And of course, as you all know, because you're probably very familiar with HMIS and NFPA, that the lowest level of hazard is 0, which we don't have a 0 category, but that the number 1 is a low hazard in that system, and 4 is a high hazard. So they're reversed. And the thing I want to point out about that is just make sure that you are thinking about that and that you don't translate your number for your hazard category into a rating of degree of hazard under the HMIS or EA. But you are permitted to continue to use these systems as long as they don't conflict with the hazard information that comes out of the standard. Again, this would not be for your shipped containers, only for your secondary container labeling in your facility. Okay, so very briefly, steps in developing a safety data sheet and label. We're going to classify the product. We're going to determine the labeling based on the classification. Then we're going to determine what ingredients have to be listed. And the OSHA standard says that we have to list the health hazards present above their cutoff concentration. Okay, so if you've got a sensitizer in your product, but it's only there at 0.05% and it doesn't make your product a sensitizer, then you don't have to disclose that. So only health hazards, things that are only physical hazards, do not have to be disclosed under the rules. Now you can disclose whatever you want to. I'm talking about what the regulations say. I also should point out that the Europeans have much more strict requirements for disclosure. They have concentration limits for disclosure on their safety data sheets that are not concentration limits for classification. So you'll have to be careful about that. You're going to have to disclose a lot more in Europe than you do here in the US. You're going to complete Section 2, detail the classification. That's writing it out. Oral toxicity, acute oral toxicity, Category 3 or whatever, and you put them all in. There could be a bunch of them. And then you'll add the labeling elements to Section 2 as well. And then make sure that you complete the rest of the safety data sheet in a way that's consistent with its classification and labeling. So the kind of information that you need to gather for your classification is the physical properties of your product. If you've got any flammable constituents, the flash point. If it's aqueous, you're going to need a pH because that will be a helpful indicator of the potential for corrosion or irritation. If you've got any hydrocarbons, you need the viscosity. And there may be other physical properties as well, but these are going to be the most important. You'll also need the classification of all of your ingredients. So we're going to talk about where you might get that information. And then you're going to need acute toxicity data for all the relevant ingredients, if you have any toxic ingredients, so that you can, well, first of all, to determine if you have a potential for acute toxicity, and second of all, to do the calculation. If there's an alternate method for using, if you have only a category, there is the GHS and then the OSHA standard that you can use in lieu of data, but it's a really conservative number, and you're going to end up with a more serious classification than if you find scientifically valid LD LC50 data to use in your calculations. And when we get together next time, I'll bring a couple of those examples that we're going to do. I'll show you the difference in the classification we get if we use those point estimates versus using real data. These are the required sections of the safety data sheet, and I'm just really quickly, so we'll have time for your questions, go through this. We'll talk again about that. The important thing is get a hold of Appendix D. That's your Bible. You want to make sure that every section and every subsection is included in the form on your safety data sheet where required. Section 1 has to have the normal stuff, the name, address, and telephone number of you, essentially. The use, though, and that's a little different. So you have to have the recommended use and any restrictions for use of your product. And you're also going to need an emergency telephone number. Now the OSHA standard says that it's not required that this number be answered 24 hours a day. So you can put your office number in, and it's recommended that if it's not available 24 hours a day that you indicate what hours it would be available. So maybe you say 8 to 5 or 9 to 5. But OSHA decided to include that requirement because it's consistent with the requirements in the GHS. In Section 2, I've already mentioned you have to have the classification of the chemical detailed, or the substance or mixture. And then all the labeling information. You do have to have either the hazard symbol itself as a pictogram if you want, or the symbol, or you can use the name of the symbol instead. Between you and me, I would put the pictogram because I think people will get confused about the correct names. There's no consistency. That the symbols are named in the standard. So if you're going to put the name instead, make sure you use the names that are in the standard. But people might call the health hazard symbol Starman, Exploding Man. They have all kinds of names for it now, and it could be people could be very confused as to what you're really trying to communicate there. We have to describe any hazards not otherwise classified. And where there's an ingredient present in your mixture that has no toxicity data, you're supposed to indicate that with a statement if it's 1% or more in your mixture. Now in Section 3, we have to include for substances the name, the CAS number, and any other unique identifiers. For mixtures, the names and the CAS numbers, of course, for the ingredients that are present above their cutoff concentration or their concentration limits and are health hazards, or that even though they're in a lower concentration still present a hazard. So if you have something that has a low level of formaldehyde in it, it's less than 0.1%, but you know in the use of your product that people can be exposed to it above, at a level that might be something of concern, then you'd have to make the judgment to disclose the presence of that formaldehyde so that the end user can then monitor in the workplace and make sure it's safe and so forth. The specific percentage for mixtures is required, but it is permitted to claim that as a trade secret. But remember that if you put in ranges or you don't put it in at all, that you put a statement in that section to say that the specific percentage is being declared a trade secret. You can't just omit it. Section 4 is going to have first aid information, and there's these two new fields called most important symptoms, effects, acute and delayed. In other words, they want a description of the typical symptoms of exposure here in Section 4, and also an indication of any specific treatment or immediate medical attention if that's necessary. So if you don't feel that there's any immediate attention or special treatment necessary, you can just say so. But you can't omit the section title, the field title. Firefighting measures, all the stuff about flammability and LELs and UELs is now in Section 9. So all you'll have here is your extinguishing media, the specific hazards, including combustion products, hazardous combustion products, and then special protective equipment for firefighters. Section 6 has information about what to do in the case of a release, so personal precautions and cleanup methods. And internationally, there's a requirement for environmental controls. If you want to add that, feel free. OSHA doesn't mind extra stuff. They just want to make sure we have the minimum. Section 7 will be storage and handling, and we're supposed to include any important incompatibilities in here about not storing a chemical with any other chemical. Section 8, we're required to put our occupational exposure limits, so we still have to do the OSHA PELs, the ACGIH TLVs, and any other exposure limit that you use or recommended. And if you have ingredients that you're putting in that come from one of the big chemical companies and they're recommending an exposure limit, you should probably pass that along. It's very useful for your your customers to have an idea of what they should be limiting exposures to. Appropriate engineering controls, and then individual protective measures such as PPE. These are all the mandatory subheadings now for Section 9. So all of these have to appear on your safety data sheet, all of them, whether you have data about them or not. One that I find people are real confused about is this one, flammability gas solid. This is in reference to data about your product flammability if it is a solid or if it is a gas. If your product is a liquid, this is not applicable. Just say not applicable. Section 9 has information on stability and reactivity, and they've divided this up differently than we have had in the past, so that'll be a little bit of a challenge for you, just sort of deciding what goes where, but it's all information that you've been looking at all these years. Section 11, we want to include all the effects by route of exposure, symptoms, and they do want numerical measures of toxicity here. So acute toxicity values for your ingredients, or if you're calculating an acute toxicity estimate, it's appropriate to put that information on the safety data sheet because that supports then the classification that you've determined in a reporting in Section 2. You also have to say in this section if you have any ingredients above their disclosure values that are listed by IARC or NTP or OSHA as carcinogen. Sections 12, 13, and 14 and 15 are non-mandatory, but if you put them in, you probably want them to have these subtitles. So there's this section here on ecological information, disposal, straightforward. We've had that in our 16 section safety data sheet forever. Section 14 is transport. Again, you may or may not choose to include that, but if you do, there's a suggested layout for that information. And then Section 15 is regulatory information. Section 16 is mandatory, and that's where OSHA wants to see the date of preparation of your safety data sheet or the last change to it. Okay, so I'm going to take 5 minutes. This is what the first page of your safety data sheet in the new world might look like. This is for a fairly hazardous chemical, lithium metal. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes here just quickly to talk about where you might get some classification information and also some data. And all of these websites, I'm sure if that you will be, well, we'll have George later if you can get these slides that have the links, or you can drop me an email and I have these on a Word document and I'll be happy to send it over to you, because then you would just not have to try to type in these very complex web addresses for data. So as far as GHS classifications go, there are classifications on the Japanese website, and you can go to the website that I have here. They're available in English, and you can download them, and they're in a spreadsheet form, and search them by their CAS numbers, and they are non-mandatory, and you may not agree with them. So I take a look at them. They're not necessarily based on the most recent information, and there is a description as to what the basis for that classification was, but again, I think you're going to want to take a look at those, and if you think that they don't seem quite right, I would look further. Korea has classified 2,500 substances, but that's available only by subscription and only in Korean, so you're probably not going to find that very useful at all. Under REACH in Europe, there are 2 different sources of information about classification. One is the classification labeling inventory, which is at that first web link here. And that is of value, but again, there's no peer review, there's no data to support these classifications. They were just the ones that everybody had to submit in 2010 for all their substances that they imported or put on the market in the EU. So they're all over the place, and so just be careful with those. If we only really look at those if we can't find anything else out there, and then we try to see if we think we might agree with them. Sometimes you will find that they have multiple entries and they're exactly the same, so I don't know why they haven't been added up together. Another thing you should be aware of when you look at that is that the first line will be the people who said this product isn't hazardous. And there could be hundreds and hundreds of them, and there might be 7 people who said it is. So pay attention to the people who said it's not hazardous. They may not be right, but if there's that many of them, they might not be wrong. The REACH registrations do have their GHS classifications for substances that have been registered. And that's probably your best source of information because that's backed up by data. And I'll show you that in just a second here. These are some of the other sites that I'm going to take you to where you might find, this is going to be more about data. You're not really going to find classifications here, but it's places where you can find out, if somebody says that this stuff causes cancer, or is there data, is there a tox value that I could use? And so some of these sites may be very useful to you. The EPA HPVIS, the High Production Volume Information System, does have some good toxicity data for U.S. high production volume chemicals that was gathered from industry a number of years ago, and that's available on their website, and really good stuff. The EU ESIS site has the EU assigned mandatory classifications for substances, and that's pretty useful. And so when you go there, I'll show you how that one works. I have a slide on that. The IPCS income I also have a slide on, so we'll skip by that. The OECD SIDS site does give data. It's not classification, but you'll find results of eye irritation, sensitization studies, and that sort of thing. So if you're struggling for a particular ingredient, or you've been given a classification that you're like, I don't really think this is true, it's a place you can go and look to see if the data that is out there is supporting what you've been told. The National Library of Medicine databases is another one, and I'll show you that too. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of these. The IPCS income site actually searches, and you can see a whole bunch of different sites here, but a lot of these come up on some of these other searches that you can do. But one of the things I do like here is that they have the reports on food additives, the monographs, and pesticide residues monographs from Europe. And so you won't find something about everything, but every now and then I'll find a really robust evaluation of a chemical by using the search on this site. So just something for you to think about. The National Library of Medicine maintains a whole bunch of different databases, and the easiest way to search all of them at once is on the ChemID Plus Lite site. And you can put in a CAS number, and then it gives you hot links to every place that they have found information about that chemical. It'll tell you if it's on the, the 313 list. Remember, there's category chemicals under that, so that's not definitive, but if the category is listed, it'll link there. And you can click on these links to open the HSDB record and find tox data there, and so on and so forth. So this is I use the site probably 20 times a day. It's a really great piece of source of information. When you go to the eSite that I showed you the link for earlier, you can find classifications for substances here. These are the ones that have been assigned by the European authorities. So we don't always agree with them, so please be careful. They don't think formaldehyde is a known human carcinogen. I don't think silica is a carcinogen either. So there's differences in methylene chloride is considered only a category 2, so a suspect carcinogen. So there's differences in how OSHA would expect us to classify certain substances and what the Europeans classify. But outside of that, it's good information, and in many cases you'll find it quite reliable. When you go to that site, you click on the GHS CLP tab. You'll find a screen where you can search, and once you open that, once you find your chemical and you click on it, then it's going to give you the GHS classification, the hazard statements, the precautionary, and the pictograms that are associated with that. So very handy information. It doesn't really do precautionary phrases, so you can't use it for that. You'll have to go back to your OSHA table. The high production volume information system I mentioned will give you data. So if you find your chemical, you may find some acute toxicity data, some repeat dose data, and stuff like that. So if you're looking for data, this is a place where you may find some that is useful. Now, the REACH registrations, I actually did this slide this weekend. So as of this weekend, there were 10,655 unique substances that have been registered under REACH. And the REACH registration dossier have data, and they also have the GHS classifications. In many cases, there'll be more than one classification, and I'll show you that. But when you're on this screen, when you go to that website, the ECHA website, you can put in the CAS number, and then make sure that you always check the little box that says you have agreed to the legal notice, or the search button won't light up for you. And once you get to your substance that you found, you're going to click on that. You'll get a little box, and you click on it, and it'll open up this entire the dossier. And here is where you're going to find the classification and labeling under the GHS and under their old system as well. And I just want to tell you that when you do click on this, it will open up and say GHS, and then it'll say DSD, which stands for Dangerous Substances Directive. There may be more than one classification. Sometimes that has to do with purity, so pay attention to that, because you may have a toluene with a 10th of a percent benzene, so that changes the classification completely as an impurity. But in other cases, there'll be self-classifications and harmonized classifications. The harmonized classifications are the ones that have been assigned by the authorities in Europe, but they didn't necessarily look at every possible hazard class when they assigned those categories. Also, they translated their old classifications to the GHS by a read across. So they didn't re-look at the data. So the self-classifications are going to be based on the technical data that's in the dossier. So I tend to look at the self-classifications to make sure that I'm getting the best information. Another thing I just want to point out, if you're looking for ecotox data, you're going to find all the fish and daphnia data. And under the tox information, you're going to find the LD50s and LC50s, and also summaries of all the studies on which they base their classifications. So just a wealth of information, and that's really going to be very useful for you. So this is a source of classification that you can more or less have confidence in. With that caveat earlier that I mentioned that Europe Europe does not follow IARC classifications, and they certainly don't look at NTP. So the carcinogenicity classifications may be not consistent with what OSHA would expect of us. This is just showing you how you can have the different classifications, and you pick the one that you're interested in. And then it also, once you open the classification, it's going to give you the positive classifications, but also if there's data, like when it says conclusive but not sufficient for classification, that's supposed to be based on data. So, or some either data from testing or some sort of science. It's not just, we don't have any information, therefore. What you will see if there's no information at all, to base a classification is they'll say data lacking. And then that means that we don't know. We didn't classify it, but we really don't know one way or the other. A couple of other interesting sites to get data. This eChem portal searches just a pile of different, all of these databases with a single search. So that's very nice because it saves you from going to a lot of the different sites, and it will open up a link, and you can follow that and trace down information about chemicals you're interested in. And this is the link to revision 4 of the GHS, but revision 5 is there as well. So once you click on this link, you'll see all the various revisions of the GHS will be on the left-hand side. You can pick the one you want. The final HAZCOM standard is available here, and so you'll want to make sure again that you have those appendices for ready reference. Also, the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication, which is a professional association rather that I'm very involved with, has done a lot of work on an alliance with OSHA on GHS awareness, and they have a lot of fact sheets and so forth. And I usually like to tell people about that in case for your training purposes, or even these are nice information sheets that summarize how to classify substances and mixtures for these hazards, and more are coming all the time. So you may want to take advantage of somebody who's compiled that into a little bit more understandable language that you can use, and it is specific to the OSHA HAZCOM standard. So it will point out where the standard, what OSHA requires, and they may mention that the GHS has other stuff, but the emphasis is on the OSHA standard. So before I answer your questions, I just want to remind you that next in Part 2, we're going to walk through several different specific ink formulas to classify ingredients. I'm going to have the ingredients classified, and we're going to send all this out to the people who sign up about a week ahead of time for the formulations that get sent to me. I'm going to classify the ingredients, I'm going to classify the products, and develop labeling, and I'm going to have all that together, and I'm going to send that to you ahead so that you can review it and kind of think about the questions that you have so that we can make that a really interactive and useful session for you for practical practice in doing this work. So for your homework, make sure that you have the OSHA standard appendices A through D. and make sure that you review the examples. So at this point, looks like we have a few questions here. George, did you want to be responsible for, or shall I just take them as they are here?
You know what, Denise? I have not been able to see the questions, so
not a problem.
Go ahead and
okay. That's great. Well, let me go through the ones that we've received. And if you have any others, just put them in the chat box there so that I can see them. Okay. So my next question was: is the warning pictogram optional on labels? No. The warning pictograms are required on all shipped containers. The only time that they'd be optional is if you're doing the alternate labeling for secondary containers for use only in your workplace. But all shipped containers will have to have any of the pictograms that are called for in the tables in Appendix C. So there are a few hazards that don't have pictograms. So if you happen to have that hazard classification and there's no pictogram, then you don't use one, obviously. But those there are only a few of those. One of them is eye irritation, Category 2B. So in that case, if you had your product or your mixture or your substance was a 2B eye irritant, then you wouldn't have a pictogram. The next question was, where does the label get placed when it's larger than the container? That's a great question and one that we get all the time. And it's very difficult when you have really small containers. And what OSHA says, actually the GHS itself has some allowances or exemptions for small containers, but OSHA they have not adopted a small container approach. They never have had one in the past, and they have not now. But and I'm going to quote them. They say they provide for practical accommodation. Now, what does that mean? The only thing I can say to you is that some of the precautionary, especially when you get into precautionary statements, some of the precautionary statements you can deem to be inappropriate. If you're selling a flammable liquid in a 20 ml plastic bottle, you can't bond and ground it. So there's one that can go. Are non-sparking tools really needed or appropriate? So you are permitted, but I caution you to take a consistent approach, look at the information that you can fit, document your logic as to why you feel that certain precautionary phrases are inappropriate. So that way you're ready with an answer if you ever get questioned as to why you dropped a particular precautionary statement. But the practicality is that when you have small containers, it's going to be a challenge, as it always has been, to fit the full labeling. So again, develop an approach that you think works for you. I think if you can justify it, you'll go a long way to keeping yourself out of trouble. But that's the best advice I can give you, Seth. George, I don't know when this PowerPoint will be made available in hard copy.
Denise, we'll make it available pretty quickly. We have everyone's email addresses, so we'll just send it out within or late this week or early next week.
Great, thank you. I also have a question about any idea how we'll define store locked up. That's again a question that I get a lot, and I think is very, very challenging. Oh, yeah, and I didn't include my email address. I will tell you all my email address in a minute here. So the issue about store locked up. OSHA, in an answer to a question at a meeting that I was at recently, was asked that question about stainless steel. So the person in the audience said, I sell stainless steel, and when it goes out and it's in the workplace, it's a big chunk of steel. It's not hurting anybody. And do I really have to say stored locked up? Because everything that's classified as a carcinogen or a mutagen or reproductive toxin is going to get stored locked up. And there are some other hazards as well. So OSHA said, well, under that circumstances, you could leave that off because it isn't a hazard in the form that it's being stored. So that's one thing that can be helpful. The other thing I think that we're just going to have to educate customers about is that there's certain mandatory language on labels that they're going to have to think about. if you have a product that has a carcinogen in it, the concept of store locked up is to keep it in an area where it's secure from the general public, people who would have no knowledge of the hazards and no training, that they would have access to it. So I think you can, if you think about it in the larger sense, a manufacturing facility, or most businesses, are secure facilities. They don't let people walk in off the street. They don't let people take chemicals home. In that sense, those chemicals are locked up. It's unfortunate that the GHS, the people who wrote the GHS, didn't always have, and to think about things. I think they thought about it in the pure hazard sense and weren't really thinking about a lot of the practicalities of what that term might mean. I certainly would like to see people keep cyanide salts locked up, really locked up. But I also think that something that has titanium dioxide that's classified as a category 2 be carcinogen and is in everything in the world, and storing that locked up doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So again, I think it's part of educating the recipients to understand that what their comfort level is in responding to that label statement, and think about whether there might be some situations like the stainless steel and other solid materials that there's no exposure to in storage, that you might feel comfortable with removing that statement. Yes, the additional resources, I'll make sure when George sends the hard copy that my email address is included there, but if you want to write it down now, it's d.deeds, and my last name D-E-E-D-S, at that's India Herald scsamcharlie.com. And I apologize, I usually put it on my final slide and I just didn't today. Again, I'll make sure that George has that to give to you so that you can ask me for any of the references, or if you have an additional question you'd like to come back with. And then let's see, I have a final question about if the ink is considered non-hazardous, there's no hazardous chemicals present because of possible spills, etc., should I still have an MSDS and label? And what would the label look like or say? Great question. You don't have to have an MSDS, never have, for non-hazardous materials under the OSHA regulation. That being said, just because some of you may market internationally, that's not true in Europe. In Europe, if you have chemicals in there, even though your product isn't hazardous, that have occupational exposure limits or have certain hazards, you still have to provide a safety data sheet, and as long as those ingredients are in there. So if you're working over there, you should get a hold of, don't make yourself crazy by reading the regulation. Go to the ECHO website and download the guidance for compilation of safety data sheets. And they have a chart in there that tells you for each hazard category and class what the concentration limit is or disclosure on the safety data sheet for either hazardous or non-hazardous mixtures. But back to your question here in the U.S., you don't have to, but the reality is your customers want a safety data sheet. So if you do one, I would just make sure in Section 2 where it says the OSHA classification, make sure that you say it's not classified as hazardous under the OSHA Hazard Communications Standard. You can put all kinds of words around that. You can refer to the stand number, whatever makes you comfortable. But I would clearly say in Section 2 that it's not hazardous. And then under the label elements, you could put something like not classified as hazardous in accordance with the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. I would also say that it's a good idea to put something on the label. So the product label, you're going to have a label anyway, because otherwise how would anybody know what they have? And you could say right on there, not hazardous in accordance with the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. That way people who pick it up and see that there's no labeling will know right away why they don't have a label, any hazard information. Now, I will also say, and that's really a great point, question there that made me think of something else, and that is your safety data sheets when you, oh gosh, I just totally lost that. I apologize. Anyway, back to that. So you will make sure that you communicate clearly the non-hazardous nature of your material and provide those to your customers will probably keep them the happiest. Alternatively, you could send them a letter and say your product's not hazardous and you don't need a safety data sheet, and see if that flies. If it does,
Denise, if I could just interject
Sure.
here for a second, I think Denise is offering excellent advice here for the reasons that she indicated, but also it's been our experience, our frequent experience, that both state and federal compliance inspectors and officers are sometimes blissfully unaware of what the requirements really are under the hazard communication standard, and we've seen a number of companies have to fight and mitigate citations based on the fact that they did not have SDSs or MSDSs for non-hazardous chemicals, and so sometimes you can avoid a lot of problems just by doing exactly what Denise indicates in terms of giving your customer an SDS which says this chemical is not hazardous under the hazard communication, not classified as hazardous under the hazard communication standard.
You know, and I was also going to mention, and I completely agree with you, and that's unfortunate that sometimes the inspectors are not trained as well as they should be. Because if you had a letter in your file, an employer had a letter saying from your supplier that if the product's not hazardous, that should suffice. But you're right, practical experience is that it may not. The thing I was going to say also is some of you, when you start putting these labels together, are going to be uncomfortable. Because unless your product has a hazard, unless it's an eye hazard, there's going to be no eye first aid. And there's not going to be skin first aid if it's not a skin hazard in some way. So you're going to do, especially if your products are low hazard, they're not going to have a lot of stuff on the label where you've probably just put first aid on there all the time just because you were more comfortable. You are permitted to put additional information on your label. I would put it in a section called supplemental labeling, and you can put additional information that you want. That's not going to be a problem. Don't mix it up with your mandatory labeling because you don't want to confuse people if they're checking against the classification that suddenly you have all these statements that don't seem to belong. So we'd have the mandatory information grouped together, a section called supplemental labeling, and then if you want to provide additional information on safe handling, on first aid, PPE, anything like that that you want that doesn't come off of those tables, then you can do that. Sort of the opposite of we can't fit it all on, I realize. But I do find that I have a number of clients who've been uncomfortable with the lack of first aid information because the product really wasn't classified as hazardous. So you can feel free to do that if you want to. Any other questions? I actually figured out I can send you my email address in the chat box, so I have provided that to you. So I'd be glad to send any of the information that I talked about today. And again, I will get the information out, these examples out to you ahead of time. Please send George formulations that, we don't want you to send us your trade secrets, but generic sort of formulas as he's requested, because the more real that I can make these examples for you, I think the better it'll be for all the attendees. So I appreciate your input to help us make Part 2 even more successful. And I'll turn it over to you, George.
Okay, Denise, I'm really, really happy with that presentation. I think, and as Denise and I had discussed prior to putting this presentation together, the integration of GHS into the HAZCOM standard has, in my view, an inordinately large impact on the producers of mixtures, and which are essentially ink manufacturers and many of our supplier ink and coatings manufacturers, as well as many of our supplier members. And so we really felt that this would be an excellent opportunity to kind of explore exactly what those rules say. And I'm excited about our next webinar on February 11th, in which we're going to actually do some practical application work with mixtures. So thank you very much, Denise, and thank you everyone for sharing your time with us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again on February 11th.
Thank you. Please stand by.